imagine that the claim we live in challenging times comes as a surprise to anyone. Each of us has been affected over the past year by the pandemic and calls for racial justice. And now, an attack on our government has further destabilized us and added to the uncertainty and the fear many people carry. Some days it may seem too much to bear, which is why Catholic ministries that respond to crises, human needs, community upheavals are as vital as ever. Even as everything seems so unstable, we continue our work of encounter and solidarity. However, though the challenges we face touch everyone's lives, they do not do so equally. Economic and political systems make it so that the poor and hungry people, communities of color, refugees, and other marginalized groups suffer more and bear a greater burden. The Society of St. Vincent de Paul and the Catholic Relief Services, CRS, are two of the largest Catholic organizations providing support to communities in need and fighting for equitable treatment. During this workshop, we will discuss how our organizations have adapted to continue the work of meeting people's immediate needs and working to break the systems of injustice. My name is Pamela Matambanadzo, and I'm a Vincentian from Chicago. I sit on the national board, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to discuss how the Society has responded to the many challenges our work and our communities continue to face. Valerie Lizárraga from Catholic Relief Services will join us shortly, but in the meantime, I'm joined by Corky Thomson, a fellow Vincentian, who will begin our portion of the workshop. Thank you, Corky.
And thank you, Pam. As Pam said, I'm Corky Thomson. I'm a Vincentian from Colorado. I am co-chair of the Voice of the Poor here, and I'm also the Midwest representative to National for Voice of the Poor. I want to tell you a little bit about the Society. We are friends, and that is the most important thing. We're friends who want to reach out and help our friends in need. Our primary value is our own spirituality and the spirituality of our fellow Vincentians, because that is the fuel that feeds the fire of when we reach out a helping hand to a friend. We were founded 175 plus years ago by Frederick Ozanam, who was an intellectual, a journalist, a lawyer, and an equal rights advocate. But although he was an intellectual, Frederick understood that it was person to person that was the most important thing. It was the climbing the stairs to sit and talk to a person, to listen, to really feel what that person was feeling. And that is where one of the most important things that makes a difference between the Society of St. Vincent de Paul and other valid, good social welfare agencies. Now, you probably know us by our stores, but we're much more than just a store that sells good household goods and clothes. We're an organization that reaches out to clothe the naked, feed the hungry, shelter the homeless, do anything that we can to help you, because no charity is foreign to the Society. But one of the things that makes us so very different from other organizations is that we come to you, the people. If you call out for help, we will be there. We will listen, but we will do more. We will go to visit you. We will try to find out your financial situation, your home situation, your employment, whatever is important for us to know and for us to be able to help you. one of the things that's very important is we help anybody who lives within parish boundaries. It doesn't make any difference whether you go to our church or your church or no church, what color, whatever. We are reaching out to help you as a friend in need. We hope we can help you pay the bill, because we understand that those who call upon us, their immediate need may be a bump in the road, but it has to be taken care of. If that car isn't fixed, then you can't get to work. Our neighbor can't pay their bills. So they go down and cycle more and more and spiral down into poverty. Now, those home visits have been something we've been doing for 175 years until now, when the pandemic hit all of us. We've had to make many, many changes in how we reach out to be a neighbor to a neighbor. So Pam is now going to tell you some of the situations we run into, how we overcome them, and how we have been able to continue the work as Vincentians in a different world from what we had been working in historically. So Pam, thank you.
Thank you, Corky. I appreciate that. And as I go to cover my slides were in the wrong order. As we look at the magnitude of what 2020 has been for us, I thought we should start on this slide with the quote from St. Vincent about love is inventive, because I think that without extreme love that the Vincentians have shown amongst themselves, and shown how they realize that some of us are suffering a lot more than others, and how to go about this. We first look at what 2020 has taught us about the inequities in the access to health that left people of color carrying the brunt of the losses, both in the number of cases as well as the death, about the economic disruptions, the ramifications of those economic disruptions, and also about the last year, and how about the school closures have affected communities where they cannot afford to have the internet or the access to computers and access to education, that when we move from in-person to remote, how that would go, or how even in the rural areas, how broadband has not expanded enough to be able to sustain access for all. All of these things, I think that, as Corky explained to you before, about how our conferences tend to choose the things that we, or how we serve based on the needs of the communities that we're in. So they do assessments to see, like here, this is just a snapshot of 157 conferences that did the survey, about looking at just some of the things that they had to work with. On switching from in-person meetings that we usually have, because generally we meet twice a month at a minimum, but sometimes more. How did we change that? You know, moving to Zoom calls to see how we continue meeting with each other, conference calls, the different things, and then switching to understanding how we serve those in need. So traditionally, the in-person visits, how did we switch from the in-person visits to serving people, the telephone conference, or how we are visiting people, but understanding exposure and trying to make sure that our Vincentians are compliant to the CDC guidelines of wearing masks and keeping distance, but still being there for the people that are most vulnerable among us. So that continuation has been necessary for us Vincentians. And then as we go further, how do we then advocate for those we serve? How do we speak for them? What modes of communication are we doing, since now we've had to change in how we communicate? You know, are we using Zoom calls? Are we using emails to communicate, to share the stories that we see? And then, so going back to, with the backdrop of the inequities and the health aspect about people of color bearing the brunt of it. So when George Floyd died, it brought about a universal awareness to racial inequities, and so the African American Task Force, along with the Voice of the Poor committees, we came together and created a webinar series to help our Vincentians find ways of both understanding the predicaments that the people that we serve are in, and how to work around those issues. So if you have time to go to our website and take a look at some of these, the racial dialogue, the civil dialogue, which was modeled around civility that the bishops used for the elections. And going into the cities, the Twin Cities, this is just, which was the ground zero of the protests, because this is where George Floyd, the community that George Floyd passed. And what we have been doing, the community, the conference that services this particular area is a predominantly Caucasian, but they service a very diverse, almost 50-50 African-American and Hispanic Latino communities. But how do they understand the cultures and the needs, and also understand what had happened with the protests and how that changes how we behave? And that took us to trying to find a conference that they partnered with. So for this pilot program that we were beginning, we chose a conference in Baltimore that serviced the area where Freddie Gray lost his life a few years ago. But that conference is predominantly African-American, and that has been very rewarding. We did this more in a retreat point of view, but definitely cementing the friendship and spirituality of service, but also trying to understand both from a cultural point of view, and understanding about the inequities and how people have coped with the inequities, but how, when we do the home visits, what sort of like mind frame we need as we do these home visits. So this has been really great. And this has been a partnership between our formation committee along with the African American Task Force, to try and see how we can actually do this and work this. Now, as the Vincentian responses during the pandemic have been vast, and in Chicago, we carried on something that we started prior to the pandemic, which was picking up the gun violence and understanding the poverty of empathy. But sadly, as we have gone through the pandemic, the gun violence has not stopped, because for us in Chicago, it's really rooted in poverty. So understanding the poverty in financial resources and resources in the North Lawndale, and understanding the poverty of empathy in the other neighborhoods. So we've joined forces with Coalition for Spiritual and Public Leadership, a group that I became more aware of in my visits to Catholic Social Ministry gathering. But we learn how to understand that it must be on terms. Any pull out of poverty has to have the people, the community's voice. They have to choose, it's on their terms, but we come in listening with open hearts, nurturing through accompaniment, and also just trying to find ways to create a participation through co-ops. But this is a work in progress, and we're still working on it. In Boston, it's been more about advocacy and teaching people access to some of the benefits, to applying, for eviction, how the eviction moratorium plays with them, or understanding better paid leave. In Galveston, it's been joining forces with other organizations and other parishes to see how they can serve their community. And our disaster relief services, that continues, because the fires and the hurricanes don't take a day off because COVID is visiting us. So I would like to extend an invitation to all of you to maybe join us for our discussion, so that maybe together we can learn and share our experiences on what the society is doing in the many different parts of the country. But thank you for taking time to watch this and being with us through this. I really appreciate it. Both Corky and I, thank you for giving us an opportunity to tell us about our experience as Vincentians and how serving those in need helps us to grow spiritually. Thank you. And now I will turn it over to Valerie, so Valerie can cover the portion for the CRS. Thank you, Valerie.
Thank you, Pamela, and thank you, Corky, so much for sharing, and thank you all of you for joining our presentation on prophetic advocacy in a virtual world. My name is Valerie Lizárraga. I am a community engagement manager with CRS West Regional Team. For those of you not familiar with CRS, Catholic Relief Services is the official international humanitarian relief and development organization of the Catholic community in the US. We work in over 100 countries around the world and serve and work with people on the basis of need, regardless of creed or nationality. The Catholic community in the US plays a critical role in helping us to accomplish our work around the world through their prayers, donations, and advocacy. In this presentation, I want to share about how the CRS community has been able to continue critical advocacy work during the pandemic, as well as some learnings we have gathered along the way that I hope you might find interesting or helpful to you and your community's ministry or work. So first, some background before I talk about how COVID impacts CRS advocacy work. I want to share briefly about what that engagement looks like. All of our work in the US is built under our issue-based campaigns. These campaigns invite communities to pray, learn, give, and advocate in an effort to address pressing global issues. As you can see here on the screen, our current campaigns are Lead the Way on Hunger and Lead the Way on Migration. You can learn more about these campaigns by visiting our campaign website, which is listed at the bottom of the slide here. And just to note that all of our campaign materials are available in both English and Spanish. And also, as a part of our campaign work, we offer an opportunity for individuals and communities to be involved more deeply through CRS chapters. These chapters offer folks a way to be engaged in a more ongoing and structured way, along with providing more opportunities to develop and practice their advocacy skills. We began building a national network of CRS chapters in parishes, universities, and high schools, and other communities a little over a year ago. As you can see from the map on the right here, we now have chapters in 17 states. Chapter members commit to taking advocacy actions each month, host community giving events and activities throughout the year, and attend a monthly national chapter video call to learn more about our campaign issues and further hone their advocacy skills. CRS chapters have been at the heart of our advocacy work over the past year, bolstered by the work of those engaged in our campaigns more generally. But what has our advocacy work focused on? So since 2019, actually May of 2019, our campaigns and our chapters have been focused on advancing a bill called the Global Child Thrive Act, also known as the GCTA. The Global Child Thrive Act requires that early childhood development interventions such as nurturing care, play, and good nutrition be incorporated into US-funded international development programs. The GCTA would be beneficial and potentially life-saving for the 250 million children around the world who are not developing as they should because they don't have access to consistent and nutritious food, adequate health care, or a safe environment in which to grow. In 2019, CRS advocates participated in Hill Days, made phone calls, wrote letters, and set up individual meetings with their members of Congress to advance this important bill. But as you all know, in early 2020, the pandemic hit and posed some big challenges to our advocacy work, and really work engaging and collaborating with communities generally. But COVID not only brought challenges to our work, it also brought more urgency, as I'm sure you can imagine. Currently around the world, there are more than 80 million people forcibly displaced and 135 people requiring 135 million people requiring food assistance. Experts are warning that food insecurity will only continue to grow due to the pandemic and that children will be among those most impacted. So while it's clear that the pandemic made our advocacy work more challenging in some ways, it also made it more critical than ever. So, however, the virtual context did present a host of challenges to accomplishing that work. So I wanted to just share just a few of the challenges that came up in our advocacy work this past year. So first here, internally, we had to relearn how to host engaging trainings and meetings for advocates in the virtual context. To start off, our staff, we had to learn how to use online platforms ourselves so we could then utilize them effectively. We had to take the time to familiarize ourselves with them so we could figure out how to maximize their capabilities for our audiences to advance our advocacy work. We had to learn and expand our understanding of best practices for engaging meetings and trainings in a virtual context, because best practices for an in-person context do not necessarily translate to a virtual one. So for example, a day-long in-person training for 6 or 8 hours might not simply be transferred to the virtual context with a 6 or 8 hour Zoom meeting. Externally, we also face challenges. First, we recognize that our advocates might not all have the same access when it comes to technology. For example, they might not have reliable or any Wi-Fi access at home. Some folks might not have access to a computer that would allow them to have full functionality or on Zoom or whatever other platform. So keeping this in mind, this really impacted our design of trainings and meetings, especially when creating and integrating interactive activities for our advocates. I don't think this challenge is something that is easy to address, and we might not be able to come up with a complete solution, but I think one key thing that we have done is do our best to be mindful of barriers to access, especially when designing agendas for virtual meetings and trainings. For example, recognizing that some activities will not be able to be completed by someone calling in via their phone the same way, and maybe coming up with alternatives for different types of participation options when it comes to these interactive activities. We also quickly discovered that generally there was a significant learning curve for our advocates in learning how to use virtual platforms, because many of these platforms were new for our advocates and we all had to jump into this new way of connecting and doing things so quickly. So connected to that, from the very start of the pandemic, we were also aware of the challenges we would face with community building in a virtual context. Our chapter members were used to gather in person on a monthly basis, which gave them a sense of support, a sense of fellowship, a sense of purpose. So we knew we needed to find ways to continue fostering genuine community in the face of distance and Zoom fatigue. Lastly, we also face some challenges with carrying out advocacy actions themselves. Luckily, some advocacy actions can be easily taken in a virtual context. It's still easy to send emails, make phone calls, and write letters to the editor. However, we had to figure out how our advocates could engage in virtual advocacy meetings. And there were various layers and complexities to that process, from how we could provide effective skill trainings online to prepare for those meetings, to what virtual platforms congressional offices were allowed to use for meetings. So these are just some examples and a sort of broad look at some of the challenges that we faced over the past year. However, despite the many challenges, we knew we had to adapt, learn, and grow to continue to advance our advocacy around the Global Child Thrive Act. So I will just share briefly some learnings that we had after a year of virtual advocacy. First is that community building continues to be essential, even in the virtual context, when it comes to mobilizing and or organizing communities or groups to take action. That connection to one another, to the broader goal or mission, is key to keep folks engaged and inspired. It is not as easy to do virtually, so we made sure we found ways to intentionally foster opportunities to continue to build community among and with our advocates. For example, we provided chapters the tools and support to transition their monthly meetings from in-person to online so they could keep meeting regularly. We began hosting more online events for chapter members and campaign participants to help stay connected, and also made sure to create the space to check in together. For example, our calls began with time for prayer and reflection before just jumping into advocacy business. We were also intentional about making sure that our meetings and trainings were interactive and gave advocates the time and space to connect with one another. We did this through integrating breakout room discussions, sharing in the chat, participating in polls, and other interactive activities. Another learning is that consistent communication is key. This can be said whether folks are able to gather in person or not, but it is especially important in the virtual context, because at a time, when it's so easy to become disconnected from our communities, it helps to maintain that connection and that relationship with our advocates. Some structures we already had in place for this, like our monthly national video calls that I talked about earlier for chapters, but these became even more important during the pandemic. For example, these national calls are spaces for our entire chapter community to gather, to learn from experts about our issues, to hear and learn from each other, to get updates on the movement of our legislation, and to practice their advocacy skills. We also regularly communicated via email about the movement of the Global Child Thrive Act and found ways to celebrate small successes along the way, whether through an email message, recording a short video, or a virtual event. These consistent and little celebrations related to the advancement of the GCTA help to maintain and generate engagement, focus, and motivation among our advocates. And another learning is the importance of strategically leveraging technology to advance the work. We use technology to continue advancing our advocacy training efforts. For example, over the course of the year, we recorded videos and held video conferences to train our advocates as an avenue for them to share best practices with one another so that they were prepared to take action on the GCTA, whether by writing to their members of Congress, calling them, meeting with them, or raising awareness in their community through letters to the editor. Additionally, we were able to leverage technology to engage more chapter members and partners in our national and regional advocacy efforts. So for example, we were able to set up virtual Hill Days for several groups of our campaign advocates, along with a training ahead of their virtual meetings with their members of Congress, where we brief them on legislation, help them practice, and train them on how to navigate a virtual meeting with their member of Congress. So this is an example of one silver lining of these challenging times, is that it made these types of regional and national activities and events more accessible. So for example, because of the virtual setting for the Hill Day, it meant that it was much easier for people across the country to participate than if the training had been in person. And the last learning related to leveraging technology that I'll share about is the importance of orienting and providing training where possible and relevant for advocates on how to use different platforms and tools. When working with advocates and communities, it is important to meet folks where they are at and walk together in the process of learning and growing in these new methods of connecting and taking action. So it might be something simple like orienting or providing a resource sheet on how to conduct a virtual meeting, or maybe it's just providing some steps for how to log on to a Zoom call and an email. It might be taking time at the beginning of a training to share some of the functions on the platform that you're using. It is an extra layer of work, but it helps to ensure that advocates can fully engage in this virtual context. And just a final learning and tip is the importance of being flexible, to be open to learn and shift to meet the needs of whatever the current context might be. As we all know, technology is always changing, and maybe, it doesn't always do what we want it to do. So having backup plans is helpful. Being okay with changing the agenda, changing plans, for a meeting is extremely helpful and important in the virtual context. And lastly, I'm happy to share that our year of virtual advocacy paid off this fall when the Global Child Thrive Act passed in the House of Representatives. Representatives Castro and Fitzpatrick actually mentioned our CRS advocates by name, thanking them for their tireless advocacy, and happy to report that on January 1st, the Global Child Thrive Act became law. And this highlights that even in this challenging time, we can, and in fact, we must continue our prophetic advocacy on legislation that will build a more just and peaceful world. The Global Child Thrive Act will help children around the world have the care that they need and deserve at a time of extreme challenges. So I hope that this is a reminder that working together and learning together in solidarity, we can make a difference even in these challenging times. And I also wanted to share this. I hope that some of what I shared was helpful to you and your community's advocacy work. If you'd like to get involved with CRS work more directly, I invite you to sign up for our campaign updates and action alerts by texting Lead Now or Lidera Ahora to 30644. But I think that brings us to our time together. So Corky, Pamela, and myself would like to thank all of you for joining our session today. I hope you will join us for the live Q&A and discussion session that is scheduled for Sunday, February 7th from 5 to 5:30 Eastern Time. Thank you.